think it's time for us to begin tonight. We're glad that you're here. As you know, Tim's away a meeting. He'll be back tomorrow night. So, but we need to be preparing ourselves for our gospel meeting this Sunday. Hope that everybody is planning on being there and inviting your friends and neighbors, family, and come and enjoy this good gospel meeting. Also, we'll be having potlucks, and so we'll look forward to seeing you there and having good fellowship with you. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about I'm not going to talk about the Kings. I know Tim is teaching on the Kings, and I'll let him continue that. But I'd like to talk to you tonight about some workers that worked with Paul. He called them fellow laborers or fellow servants. He called them fellow prisoners, fellow workers. There were several names that he had for them. And some of these were worked out well, but others didn't work out as well. And so I wanted to look at first at that one that didn't work out well, and then one that didn't work out so well, and then I want to look at a couple that worked out well. So we're going to go through like three different people tonight. And but the first one I want to talk about is a man named Demas. Demas is considered as a fellow worker of Paul. If in Philippians, verse 20, or Philemon, verse 24, you'll read that it said that salute to Demas, my fellow laborer. And so Demas then started off as a good person. He was working with the Apostle Paul. And these guys did a lot of things that we don't realize. You know, when you read about Paul, Paul says that he didn't baptize very many people. We read that in 1 Corinthians. Just very few. So these people would be people that would work with him, that would even do a lot of the teaching on the side, and a lot of the baptisms and encouragement and building the church up. So Demas started out in the book of Philemon, in verse 24, as a fellow worker of Paul. And then we read about Demas again in Colossians chapter 4. And Paul says that, he just simply says that Demas greets you. That's all it said about him. Demas greets you. You know, usually, and all of you are familiar with Paul's letters, at the end of his letters, he always wrote the people that work with him and salute them and greet them. And matter of fact, if you look at Romans chapter 16, almost the whole chapter is of people that worked with the Apostle Paul. And then the last time we read of Demas is the last book that Paul wrote evidently before his death, and that's the book of 2 Timothy. And that's when he said that, you remember, I fought a good fight, I finished my faith, I finished the course, I've kept the faith and finished the course, therefore is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me in that day, but not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing. And so, but you read of Demas there, and what Paul says about Demas is so sad. He says, Demas has forsaken me, loving this present world. What a tragedy. Somebody that had that opportunity to work with the Apostle Paul, and then near the end, he had forsaken Paul and had gone back, evidently, into the world. And so that wasn't a very good person to start off with as a companion of the Apostle Paul. But the second one I wanted to talk about is John Mark. John Mark is the man that wrote the book of Mark. And he was one that we read about in Acts 12, that when Paul had gone Paul and Barnabas had gone and taken supplies to Jerusalem, John Mark was with them. He helped them. And then when you read in chapter 13, when Paul went on his first missionary tour, he took John. It said that in verse 5, and when they were at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogue of the Jews, and they had also John to their ministry. And so John Mark went with them on their first missionary tour. But then when you get down to verse 13, when they came to Perga of Pamphylia, it says, John departed from them, returning to Jerusalem. Now, we don't know why John turned back. He was with Paul on this tour with Barnabas, and of course Luke would have probably been there too, because Luke wrote the book of Acts. And when you see in the book of Acts where it says, we went here, we went there, that means that Luke was with them, because Luke was the author of the book of Acts. And so, but John turned back. Now, I don't have any idea why John turned back. Maybe he had a legitimate reason. Maybe there was something happened in his family. Maybe we just don't know. And so, but I think the Apostle Paul didn't think he had a reason, the legitimate reason to turn back. Because if you turn to Acts chapter 15 and you get down to verse 36, we see that after they had settled this occasion about the circumcision, that Barnabas said to Paul, let's go again and visit every brother in every city where we preach the word of the Lord, and see how they do. In other words, they had gone on their first missionary tour. They had come back. Acts 13 and 14 talks about all the cities that they'd went to. And now they'd come back and they reported back to the church all the things that had happened. And so Barnabas says, let's go again and visit these brethren and encourage them, see how they're doing. Make sure they're staying faithful. And Barnabas had determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. Now, Barnabas, you remember Mark, the first tour they went, he got at Perga of Pamphylia, not too far out, and he turned back and went back for some reason. We don't know why. Now, Barnabas was wanting to take John Mark with them this time. Now, I think one of the reasons why, we find out from the book of Colossians, Barnabas and Mark were relatives. They were either cousins, or I really can't get it straight that they were cousins, or Barnabas was his uncle. It says something about sister's son, and so I don't know for sure, but anyway, he was a relative of John Mark. And so he thought, maybe John had explained this to him more, but maybe he thought that was reason enough to not take Mark to take Mark with him. And so notice, but Paul thought it not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. So Barnabas says, hey, let's go again to visit the churches. We'll take Mark with us. Paul says, no, I don't think it's a good idea to take Mark with us, because he turned back from the work the first time. And notice the contention, and the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder, one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So here you see the split of Paul and Barnabas because of this. They decided, and here's the good thing about it. Even though there was contention between them, look how it worked out. There was 2 missionary tours going out now instead of just one. And that's great. And so But then, when we finally, at the end of Paul's life, when in 2 Timothy 4, where he wrote the last book that he wrote, and he was going to lay down his life, Paul evidently forgave Mark, because he told Timothy, take Mark with you, because he's good for the ministry. And so Paul didn't hold this grudge all the time. He just thought it wasn't good at this time to take him because he had turned back. And they split up and went on different tours. And then, but at the end of his life, Paul says, take Mark, because he's good for the ministry. And so, although this didn't turn out like the other, at least Paul didn't have as much success with Mark. Like I say, we don't have any idea why Mark turned back. There's nothing that indicates that. It just says that Mark turned back. Evidently, Paul thought it wasn't a good enough excuse. But anyway, the third person I want to talk about is the one that I want to focus our lesson on today, is a couple by the name of Priscilla and Aquila. If you turn to Acts chapter 18, and that's where most of our study will be in this, we see that Paul, you remember in chapter 17, Paul had visited Mars Hill and had preached there and didn't have very much success. Very few people obeyed because they were just philosophers and wanted to hear something new and really wasn't interested in the gospel of Christ, but a few obeyed. But Paul left there and he came to Corinth. He went, if you look at verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And so evidently Paul was there. He had gone to Corinth, and here Priscilla and Aquila had come to Corinth and had, well, later on, just a couple of verses, we'll see that they had the same craft. They were tent makers, and they worked with Paul, but they had come to Corinth because they were exiled out of Rome for some reason. The emperor had made a decision that all Jews had to leave Rome. And so here they came to Corinth. And notice, because they were the same craft, or they were tent makers, he abode with them and wrought for by their occupation they were tent makers. And so this is what we read about to start with, about Priscilla and Aquila. They came from Rome. They were tent makers. They met up with the Apostle Paul. They were staying together in Corinth and working together. And so we see then, if you go on down, the next time that we read of Priscilla and Aquila is in Acts chapter 18 and verse 26. And we see that Paul had I'm sorry, it's not verse 26, it's verse 19, 18 and 19. Paul had some difficulty there in Corinth. They had brought charges against him, and this man named Gallio, he was like the deputy that heard over it, and he said, and the Jews brought these charges against Paul, and he said, hey, if it's a matter of your law, you guys handle it. I just, I don't want to hear it. That's sort of paraphrasing, but that's the way it ended up saying. And so they took Sosthenes, who was the ruler of the synagogue, and they beat him instead of beating the Apostle Paul. So Paul actually won that decision. And so now Paul is, notice in verse 18, and Paul, after this, tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and called thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shown his head in Cenchrea, for he had made a vow. Now, evidently, Paul had made a vow with these Jews, and it wasn't nothing for him to cut his hair off. I mean, he didn't want to argue over these vows, and he wanted to teach them the gospel. But Priscilla and Aquila was with them, and he left them, notice, and he came to Ephesus and left them there. And so this is how much confidence Paul had in Priscilla and Aquila. He was able to leave them in Ephesus, and if you just read down a little bit farther, Paul was going back to Jerusalem for a feast day, and then he said he would come back to Ephesus. He had a feast day that he must keep in Jerusalem, and then he would come back to Ephesus. But and so Priscilla and Aquila stayed there with the church there in Ephesus. Now, verse 24, notice this. A certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, an eloquent man and mighty in the scriptures, came to Ephesus. Now, Alexandria was quite a few hundred miles away, and Apollos came there. Now, this Apollos was a good man. As a matter of fact, we read about him later in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You remember when there's having that division among the church, and some says, I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Paul, and I'm of Christ. Well, one of the things they said, I'm of Apollos. He was one of the main teachers. And then we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that Apollos was one that Paul says, I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And so Apollos was a good worker, but he came to Ephesus from Alexandria, and he was eloquent in the scriptures, mighty in the scriptures. But notice what happened. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in the spirit. He spake and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. And so he came to Ephesus, and he was teaching there, but he only knew about the baptism of John. He did not yet know about the fact that Christ had died, and now the church had begun, and John's baptism was no longer valid. It wasn't a baptism that you would practice. And so he only knew about this, evidently because he was out at Alexandria, which is, like I say, maybe, I didn't check the distance, but I guarantee it's 300 or 400 miles, quite a ways away then. That's nothing today. But during that time, that was a long distance to travel. And so, but he had only heard about this baptism of John. And that's what he was teaching. He was teaching people, preparing them for the kingdom, just like John the Baptist was. And so, notice as he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla had heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of the Lord more perfectly. Now, here Priscilla and Aquila were in the church there at Ephesus. They heard this man who was very eloquent in the scriptures came and he talked, but he only knew about the baptism of John. And so when they seen that, they took him aside and they talked to him. And no doubt they told him, look, you're right on all these other things, but John taught that there was one coming after him that was mightier than him, whose shoes he could not even unlatch. And John also taught that he must decrease, but he must increase. And So the Messiah has come now. And we no longer baptize in the name of John. And so they took this man that was eloquent in the scriptures and taught him this. And so when he had disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote a letter, and when he was come, helped them very much that which had believed through grace, for he had mightily convinced the Jews, that publicly showing by the scriptures that Jesus was Christ. And so he changed his teaching. He began to teach then that Jesus was the Christ, not John, not preparing for the kingdom, but the kingdom have come, and now we can work together and be in the kingdom by being obedient to the gospel of God's Son. Now, if you read the first 4 or 5 verses, and we're not going to read them, of the next chapter, you'll see there was 12 people there, evidently, that Apollos had baptized. And remember, he only knew what? The baptism of John. He didn't know about the baptism of Christ. And this was after the baptism of Christ came into effect. And so Paul taught them and asked them about their baptism. And they said they only knew the baptism of John. Well, Paul taught them about Christ. And this is the only instance in the New Testament where anybody was rebaptized. These 12 men were rebaptized into the name of Christ, into the church. But evidently they were ones that was taught by Apollos. But I said all that to say this. What's some lessons that we can learn from Priscilla and Aquila, from this good couple? And I think there's like 3 or 4. Now, they are also talked about. Paul talks about them, and we won't have the time to go to these. But in Romans 6 and verse 3, he talks about Priscilla and Aquila, how that they were willing to risk their lives for the sake of the church, and that they had the church in their house. In 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 19, he again talks about Priscilla and Aquila and the church that was in their house. And then also in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 19, he again commends Priscilla and Aquila. They were good people. They were, as a matter of fact, in one of those, it's either in Romans, I think it's Romans, where it says that all the Gentile people spoke well, the Gentile church spoke well of Priscilla and Aquila. They would never remember they were Jews from Rome, and that's an accomplishment in itself. If a Gentile spoke well of a Jew, or if a Jew spoke well of a Gentile. But anyway, they spoke well of him. But let's notice some things that they did that made them stand out. First of all, they seemed to be faithful in everything they did. They did what the Apostle Paul asked them to do, and they had a good report of the people from without, and they seemed to be faithful in everything they did. But the points I want to point out is when they were moved, when they had to leave Rome and come to Corinth, the very first thing they did was find the church. And that ought to be a lesson for us. When we go someplace, or if we have to move, if I had to move someplace, the first thing I would do is go to that place and check out where the church is, what it's about, and everything, and know that I have a place to go to worship. We go every year for the last probably 30 or 40 years. We've gone to Topsail Island, North Carolina. Even some of you have gone with us down there. But the closest church down there is probably 30 to 40 miles away. And a lot of times my children ask me, wouldn't it be great if we lived here all the time? Well, it might be great as far as the facilities are concerned, the ocean and all like that. But brethren, you would die spiritually. I wouldn't move to a place like that. I wouldn't go to a place where I couldn't be where the local church is. You don't want to serve the Lord all your life and then at the end of your life lose what you've been working for all your life. And so we need to realize they put the church first. Now, you guys need to do some talking. Nobody's said anything. I'm doing all the talking. And I'm getting dry. Yes?
I like in verse 26 of Acts 18, the way they did this teaching. They took him aside and explained the way of God more accurately. That's the New King James translation. So I think that approach, obviously this man was speaking openly, eloquently, in front of a group potentially, and it wasn't a rebuke in a public way, at least the way I read this. So the mode in which they taught this individual, I think, is another fine lesson for us.
I'm going to get to that. But that's good. That's good. That's good. That's good that you're talking about that. But they truly put the church first in their lives. In the second place, Paul says they risked their necks for him because they had the church in their house. That was a risky thing at the end. You think of this when you think like in John chapter 20, verse 19, when Jesus had been crucified, the 10 apostles that met, Thomas wasn't with him, Judas had hanged himself. The 10 apostles that met, they had the doors locked, and Jesus came in the midst of them. But what they said, it said they had the doors locked for fear of the Jews. They were afraid. You go over like Acts chapter 12. You remember when Peter was in prison and the angel released him and let him out, and he came out, and finally he goes to the house of John Mark's mother, Mary, and they're holding services there. But they had Rhoda outside by the gate to watch, evidently, for people, because they met secretly, and for fear of being persecuted. In Acts chapter 17, we read of where Paul was in Thessalonica, and they came after him, and it said they assaulted the house of Jason. Not you, Jason, but another guy named Jason. But they assaulted the house of a man named Jason and took him in, evidently arrested him because he had housed them. It was a difficult thing. And I just wonder today, if we were in that situation, would we be willing to hold the church in our house? Would we be willing to have people there in our house come and worship God and take a chance on if the authorities caught us, then we're going to suffer some consequences. Now, I don't know what all the consequences was. I don't know if they would lose their home, or if they would be put in jail, or perhaps they would be even killed for this. Paul said they risked their necks for him because of the church that was in their house. And so they were willing to do this and to promote the gospel of Christ. Sometimes when the church comes up against difficult things, they react different. I remember, I don't know, maybe Bonita is here, and I don't know how many here that used to go to Sullivan Avenue. Don did. Okay. I don't know if Don, if they remember this or not, but when we were on Sullivan Avenue, we had bought an old theater building. By the way, it's the best church seats I've ever seen, ever had. They were nice. But we worshiped in that theater building. But the building right next door to us, there was a business in it. And it went out of business. And we were scared to death that somebody, like perhaps that owned a bar or something like that, would buy that building and be right there beside the church, someplace that we didn't want them to be. And so we got a proposal to see if we couldn't buy this ourselves. And you know, the church was able, and this was in the 70s, but the church was able to get enough money together to purchase that building. And all we had to do was knock a hole in the side of the wall, because the buildings were connected, and we was able then to put classrooms down. Do you remember that, Don? We had classrooms. I know Bonita does. We had classrooms on the other side. But people acted. And I know the couple that actually didn't have anything to give, and they cashed in their insurance policy in order to have something to give to the church to do this. And so when there's necessities, people, you know, act different. They respond to that. And so I'm thankful that we got brethren like that respond to those things. But they had the church in their house, and they risked their lives, and yet they were faithful in everything they done. Yeah, Don.
It wasn't a risk of lives, but you held that homes
We did. We did. What Don is talking about, during that time, in order for us to transfer from that building to this building, we had to sell that building over there, and this building wasn't all the way complete. And we had to meet, we actually met, divided up, and met in homes. As a matter of fact, my home was one of the homes that people came to and worshiped. We had different people going to different homes just for a very short time. And then we finally was able to rent the Westgate Recreation Center and meet in that. And that was during, by the way, and maybe some of you remember that was during a time when they had this energy shortage, where on the weekends they would cut the temperature down to 50 degrees or less in these rec centers. I mean, the city would. You could rent them, but you better wear some good clothes when you came. But I remember that too, before we finally met in here. And then we finally made our first meeting in here in August of 1977. And so when there's things that happen, the church responds to those different things. And I'm thankful for that. And then finally, what Jason was talking about, when they heard error taught, they were willing to go ahead and take somebody aside and teach them. Now, I've got a sheet of paper in my Bible, if I can find it. On this paper, I wrote down some things that is smart or wise to use as you try to teach somebody. I suppose all of you probably have taught people before, and if I'd asked people to hold up their hand, maybe all of us would have to hold up our hand. Have you ever made anybody mad when you teach them? Have you ever, you know? And I suppose maybe all of us have said things, especially to family members. We say things and we, you know. But this to me, I wrote these up because I think it's just a good guideline to go by if you're teaching somebody. First of all, remember, you can be right and yet be wrong. Now, that sounds strange, doesn't it? You can be right and be wrong. What I'm talking about is the way you talk to people. You can be right. I remember when I was a young boy, we went to the Pentecostal church. I had never heard about the Church of Christ. And there was a fellow that lived on the side of the road, and we'd have to go by his house to go to church. We'd always be going to Sunday school, you know, and things like that on Sunday mornings. And he'd say, "Where are you boys going?" He knew where we was going. But anyway, we'd say, "Well, we're going down here to church." He'd say, "Well, if you don't go to the Church of Christ, you're going to be lost anyway." Now, you know what? He was right in what he said. It's only going to be the Lord's church that's going to be saved. But he was wrong in the way he said it. Because he had me so mad that I thought, I'll never go to the Church of Christ. I so twisted my arm, but anyway, but you know, you can do that. You can be so abrasive to people that you turn them off. And so remember that when you're studying with somebody. And second thing I put on my list was put yourself in their shoes. What if somebody was trying to teach you like that? How would you feel about that? You know, nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. Nobody likes that. They just don't like that. That's hard to accept, especially about religion. That's hard to accept. So put yourself in their shoes and let them know. Third thing I wrote down was praise them for what they've done. If they're a believer in God, say, "I'm thankful that you believe in God. I'm thankful you believe that Jesus is the Christ. But I just want to show you what the Bible says about this." And I've got to hurry up because I'm about out of time. In the fourth place, in the next place, leave the study with a good attitude. Don't close the door. So many people that you talk to, they close the door. I remember we had a fella that I worked with at Worthington, and I taught him the gospel. And he went around to all these different people. And he said, you know, he was almost like that guy I told you about on the side of the road. Well, if you don't go to the Church of Christ, you're lost anyway. I had people coming back to me and say, "Hey, you go to church where he does?" And I had to say yes, you know. Well, I'd never go there, you know, because you turn people off. We need to make sure, if you can't teach them, keep the door open so that others can come in and teach them. But when you think of Priscilla and Aquila, think of the good things they done. They were faithful in all things. They looked out for the church first. They had the church in their house, and they were able to take a preacher aside, like Jason talked about, and teach him more perfectly the way of the Lord and not upset him. And that preacher went on to be a great man in the brotherhood for the cause of Christ. Thank you very much for listening to me tonight.